The night was charged with electricity. It was April 20th, 1982, at the Milton Keynes Bowl in England, where more than 65,000 fans had gathered to watch Queen perform. The roar of the crowd was deafening, the kind of sound that rattled through the chest and stayed there. Freddie Mercury, dressed in a sleek white jacket trimmed with red, strutted across the massive stage with his usual bravado. The spotlight followed him like a halo, and yet for a brief moment he seemed distracted. In his hand, almost hidden from the audience, was a small cream-colored envelope, folded and slightly crumpled as if it had been carried around for too long. Nobody in the crowd knew that this envelope contained words Freddie had never dared to say out loud. Behind the flamboyance and the dazzling lights, Freddie was fighting a private battle. Fame had given him everything. A voice adored worldwide, stadiums filled with people chanting his name, and the kind of immortality most artists only dream of. But it hadn't given him peace. The letter he held was not part of the show, not part of the rehearsed Magic Queen delivered night after night. It was personal. It was dangerous. It was a confession that, if revealed, could change how the world saw him. For a man who built a life on carefully crafted mystery, the idea of baring his soul terrified him more than any high note. The band was tearing through Somebody to Love, and Freddie's vocals soared effortlessly above Brian May's guitar. Yet every time he gripped the microphone, his other hand brushed against the envelope, tucked inside his jacket pocket, reminding him of the decision he had to make that night. Would he keep the secret locked away, or risk everything by letting it out? The audience had no idea, but Freddie knew before this night was over, the world would see a side of him no spotlight had ever revealed. As the concert raged on, the energy in the stadium was overwhelming. 65,000 voices shouted Freddie's name, their hands clapping in unison, waves of sound crashing back against the stage. From the outside, it looked like Freddie Mercury was at the absolute height of his powers. His voice was strong, his movements theatrical, his presence larger than life. But on the inside, the weight of that folded letter pressed against his chest like a stone. For years, Freddie had carried this burden in silence. He was a man of masks. On stage, he was untouchable, the god of rock and roll, commanding thousands as though they were his personal choir. Off stage, he was quiet, vulnerable, and often lonely. The letter he had written was not for the fans, not even for the band. It was for one person who had stood by him through shadows and storms, who had offered him something he rarely allowed himself to accept: unconditional love. As he introduced the next song, Freddie paused longer than usual. He stood still, the microphone trembling slightly in his hand. Brian May glanced at him, sensing something was different. Roger Taylor kept the rhythm going, waiting for Freddie to jump back in. The crowd, restless but loyal, began chanting his name louder, urging him forward. But in Freddie's mind, the noise faded. He was thinking only of the envelope. He could feel the edges of the paper digging into his chest as if begging him to reveal its contents. Tonight, he thought, I can't hide anymore. Backstage, away from the floodlights and the roar of the crowd, sat a quiet figure who had always been Freddie's anchor, Mary Austin. She wasn't part of the band. She wasn't a manager. She wasn't there for the fame. She was there because Freddie had trusted her with the truest parts of himself long before the world ever knew his name. Their story was complicated. Once lovers, now bound by something even deeper, a love that transcended romance, a loyalty stronger than blood. Mary knew Freddie like no one else. She could read the slight change in his smile, the hesitation in his steps, even from a distance. That night she noticed something unusual. Freddie kept reaching into his jacket as if checking for something, guarding it with the same ferocity he guarded his voice. She didn't know about the letter yet, but she felt it. Something was brewing inside him, something that might break free. While the band pushed forward into the setlist, Mary waited in the shadows, her hands clasped, her heart tightening with every note Freddie sang. She had seen him fearless on stage countless times, but tonight there was a fragility in his eyes that unsettled her. She whispered to herself, "What are you planning, Freddie?" Little did she know, the answer was tucked into the envelope resting against his chest. And before the night was over, that secret would come to light, not just for her, but for thousands watching. The night had reached its fever pitch. Queen had just finished "We Will Rock You," and the thunder of 65,000 stomping feet shook the very ground beneath the Milton Keynes Bowl. Freddie stood center stage, chest heaving, his sweat catching the glow of the spotlights. He should have felt invincible. Instead, he felt cornered by the truth burning in his jacket pocket. He raised the microphone, ready to launch into Bohemian Rhapsody, but then he froze. For the first time that night, Freddie Mercury, who could command any crowd in the world, fell silent. The band exchanged uneasy glances. The audience, sensing something out of place, grew quieter, their cheers fading into a low murmur. What was happening? With trembling fingers, Freddie reached into his jacket. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out the small cream-colored envelope. The sight of it in his hands was disarming. It didn't belong to the grandeur of the stage. It was personal, fragile, almost out of place in the massive arena. Freddie held it up to the lights, staring at it for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, he pressed it against his heart. The entire stadium hushed. Tens of thousands leaned forward, waiting. Something far more important than a song was about to happen. Freddie Mercury, the man who lived behind glitter and fire, was about to let the world glimpse the most vulnerable corner of his soul. Freddie stepped back from the microphone, his eyes locked on the letter in his hand. For a man who had performed, for millions, silence had never felt so loud. He carefully unfolded the paper, the stage lights catching the slight tremble in his fingers. The crowd held its breath. Some thought it was part of the show, an unusual dramatic gesture before a song. But those who looked closely could see it. This was no act. He lifted the paper, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it in such a setting. "To the one who has always been my home." The words echoed across the massive arena, carried by the sound system to the furthest seats. It wasn't a lyric. It wasn't a joke. It was a confession. The audience, normally so loud and restless, went utterly still. Tens of thousands of people leaned into the silence, hanging on every syllable. Freddie's eyes glistened as he continued. He didn't name names, but Mary, watching from the wings, knew. The letter spoke of love that never faded, of fears he had never dared to share, of a longing for peace that even fame could not bring. He spoke of masks he wore, of nights spent alone despite the adoration of millions. And then came the words that shook even his bandmates. "If the world knew me as I truly am, would they still love me?" Gasps rippled through the audience. This wasn't just music anymore. Freddie Mercury had stopped the greatest show on earth to bare his soul. He had chosen to risk everything for truth. For a few impossible seconds, the entire Milton Keynes Bowl was suspended in silence. 65,000 people, who only moments ago had been roaring with thunderous applause, now sat frozen, their eyes fixed on the man who had just revealed his deepest fear. Freddie's words, "Would they still love me?" lingered in the night air like smoke, fragile and unanswerable. Brian May lowered his guitar slightly, his face pale with shock. Roger Taylor stopped tapping his sticks against the snare, his eyes locked on Freddie as though afraid to move. Even John Deacon, usually so composed, shifted uneasily, the gravity of the moment sinking into his chest. For the first time in Queen's long reign of unstoppable performances, the show was no longer about music, it was about the man behind the voice. Then it happened. A voice from the crowd shouted, trembling but clear, "We love you, Freddie." Another followed, and another. Within seconds, a wave of sound surged through the stadium, not in the form of chanting or song, but in a simple, unified declaration, "We love you." Thousands repeated it louder and louder until it became an ocean of voices crashing back at him. Tears welled in Freddie's eyes as the people who had come for entertainment were now holding him up with something greater, acceptance. He clutched the letter against his chest, his head bowed. In that instant, the mask he had worn for so many years cracked, and the world saw not Freddie Mercury the legend, but Farrokh Bulsara, the man who had been searching for unconditional love his entire life. Freddie stood motionless for a moment, the roar of "We love you" still rolling like thunder across the stadium. Slowly he lifted his head, a tear cutting through the sweat on his cheek. He pressed the letter one final time to his heart, then did something that no one expected. He held it out to the crowd, raising it high above his head as if offering it to every soul present. The stadium lights caught the paper, making it glow, like a fragile beacon in the night. The fans responded with a reverence usually reserved for sacred rituals. The screaming gave way to a collective hush, as though 65,000 people had instinctively understood they were witnessing something holy. Then, in a voice that trembled but carried to the very edges of the bowl, Freddie whispered into the microphone, "This is my truth. Tonight, you all share it with me." And then, almost like a rebirth, he launched into Bohemian Rhapsody. But this time, it wasn't just a performance. Every note, every word carried the weight of his confession. The crowd didn't just sing along, they sang as if they were answering him, assuring him he wasn't alone. When he reached the line, "Nothing really matters to me," the audience's voices swelled louder than the band itself, as though declaring that Freddie Mercury, the man and not just the myth, mattered more than anything. From the side of the stage, Mary Austin wept silently. She understood that the letter was for her, but now it belonged to everyone. It was no longer just a private love note. It had become a symbol of Freddie's humanity, immortalized by the voices of thousands who chose compassion over judgment. When the final notes of Bohemian Rhapsody faded into the night, Freddie collapsed to his knees, exhausted yet unburdened. The audience roared, not the usual frenzy of applause, but a sound filled with reverence, as if they were thanking him for letting them carry his truth. In that moment, Freddie Mercury was no longer just the untouchable frontman of Queen. He was a man who had dared to confess, and the world had embraced him for it. Backstage, Mary Austin rushed to his side. Freddie pressed the letter into her hands, his eyes soft but resolute. "It's yours," he whispered. "It always has been." Mary clutched it tightly, tears streaming down her face, knowing she had witnessed something the world would never forget. For her, it was more than a gesture. It was Freddie's soul on paper, finally freed. The story of that night spread quickly through fans, whispered about in pubs, written about in magazines, and remembered in hearts. Though the exact words of the letter remained private, its meaning lived on. Fans spoke of how Freddie stopped an entire show not for spectacle, but for honesty. Musicians who played at the Milton Keynes Bowl in years to come would often hear about the night Freddie showed his heart. It became legend, not because of the songs performed, but because of the humanity revealed. Years later, when people spoke of Freddie Mercury, they didn't just remember the dazzling costumes or the impossible high notes. They remembered the night he held up a simple piece of paper and asked the world if love could survive truth, and the world answered back with one voice, "We love you, Freddie." And that, more than fame, more than glory, became his lasting legacy. The night a love letter turned into a testament of humanity, courage, and the power of being known.